This video will be looking at Numbers 31 verses 17 to 18, and we will be answering common objections that people have to the verses. So let's read the verse. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. So this video will answer the objections of why kill the boys, why kill the women who slept with a man, why spare the girls who never slept with a man, does this verse allow pedophilia and rape of preteen girls and sexual slaves, and how do you know who is a virgin? Okay, so to understand this verse, first we need to understand who the Midianites and Moabites are and why God is judging them according to the acts they committed. For those of you who don't know, the Midianites and Moabites can be used interchangeably, as both of them committed the same offenses against Israel. So the first passage we will go to is Numbers 31 verses 1 to 3, where it is explained that the Lord spoke to Moses and told him to take vengeance on the Midianites for the sons of Israel. So from this passage we learn that God is telling the Israelites to go to war with the Midianites as an act of vengeance. So God is using Israel as the instruments of his judgment against the Midianites. This presupposes that the Midianites did something to deserve this judgment. So now let's find out what the Midianites did to deserve God's judgment. In Numbers 22 verses 2 to 6, we found out that Balak, the king of Moab, saw the Israelites, defeated the Amorites, and he was scared of their great number. So he wanted to curse the Israelites so that he could then defeat them and drive them out of the land. So from this we learn that Moab instigated the hostility towards Israel, and the Moabites were trying to kill and exile them from the land. Then in Numbers 22 verses 5 to 6, we find out that King Balak approached Balaam to curse Israel so that he could smite them. However, we find out later in Numbers 24 verse 13 that Balaam could not curse them as God had blessed Israel. Balaam makes this clear when he says, "I could not go beyond the word of the Lord, to do good or bad of my own will." Throughout Numbers chapters 23 to 24, we read Balaam tried to curse the Israelites 3 times, but instead they were blessed because God was protecting them and was the source of their blessing. So now that Balak was unable to get Balaam to curse Israel, he came up with another plan that we see in Numbers 31 verse 15 to 16. Here we find out that Balaam advised the Midianites to have their women entice the Israelite men into having sexual relations with them, so God would punish the Israelites for their sin. This was bad, as not only were these women not their wives, but they were pagan women who the Israelites were ordered not to intermingle with, as we see in Deuteronomy 1 to 6. These verses also explain that the Israelites were not to intermingle with the pagan nations around them, as they would turn to follow their false gods, as men would try to please the women or vice versa. Now when we look at Numbers 25 verses 1 to 3, it explains that the Israelite men were being seduced by the Moabite women into doing sexual sins. The women also enticed them into worshipping their false gods known as Baal and sacrificing their children to him. Then in Numbers 25 verse 9 we find out that 24,000 Israelite men were killed, as they had been seduced by the Midianite women and had joined in the worship of Baal. So now that we understand the context of what the Midianites did and why they were getting judged by God, let's answer the common objections that people have in regarding to the verse. Alright, so the first objection we'll answer is why the boys were killed. One of the reasons that the Midianite boys might have been killed is that during the time frame in question, tribal warfare was rampant, and it was likely that the male children would grow up and seek revenge for their fathers and grandfathers against Israel. Another reason that the Midianite boys might have been killed is that they had been raised in utterly disgusting depravity, which is well documented. Regular behaviors among the Midianites included child sacrifice, cult prostitution, and bestiality. The divine prohibition of these acts was codified, and the acts were well known by the Israelites. We see this in Leviticus 18 verses 20 to 24. Male inhabitants carrying on the lineage of this culture would have been a problem for Israel, as they would have continued practicing these abominable behaviors and influenced Israel to do the same. Now, another perspective on this issue that we should look at is the divine perspective. Now, we cannot know the mind of God or comprehend the depths of his wisdom, stated in Isaiah chapter 55 verses 8 to 9. But we know that given the depravity of the Midianites, God's command to kill the Midianite boys might have been an act of divine mercy. In his perfect knowledge, including his knowledge of what would happen in the lives of those young Midianites had they lived, it is possible that God brought them to himself before they had the opportunity to choose to reject him or to sin. It is highly possible that had these young males grown into maturity, they would have embraced the wanton rebellion and idolatry of their fathers. From God's perspective, it might have been better for them to die at a young age rather than endure a life of depravity. Now, I'll also play a clip here from Cross-Examined, which adds another reason as to why the divine perspective should be considered.
That's one view. The other view is the traditional view that, no, he literally meant to take their lives. Well, what do we say to that? Let's take the harder view, that God said everybody should die. Can God do that? Here's my question. Is God committing murder by ending lives on earth? When somebody dies, does God murder them? No, God can't murder anyone because he's the creator of life. So when he takes life, that's up to him. He can resurrect life. We can't do that, so we don't have the authority to take innocent human beings' lives. But God does. So if God wants to take somebody's life, he can, if he has a reason for it. He might explain the reason, he might not. But he has the authority to do that. In fact, if Christianity is true, people don't really die, they just change location, right? They move from one life to the next life. So, God has the right to usher people into the next life, whether they are 2 years old or 82 years old. God can do that, we can't.
Now let's address the objection why the women who had slept with a man were killed. From Numbers 25 verses 1 to 2, Numbers 25 verse 9, and Numbers 31 verses 15 to 16, we learn that women were killed because they were the ones who enticed and caused the Israelite men to commit sexual sin, and they got them to worship Baal and sacrifice their children to him. Alright, so now let's take a look at why the virgin girls were allowed to live. The reasons the virgins were allowed to be left alive is not for sexual relief, it's because they did not partake in the seduction of the Israelites. Hence, they are innocent girls who committed no crimes, so they are allowed to live. Moreover, now let's take a look at the objection of, does this verse support pedophilia, rape of preteen girls, and sexual slaves? For this objection, I'll let Islam Critiqued explain it because he does it very well. Link to his channel in the description below.
Welcome back, everybody. Many Muslims criticize Numbers chapter 31 in the Old Testament. We'll take a look as an example at a comment on a mind-numbingly stupid website called Answering Christianity. Honestly believe that looking at content this dumb can kill brain cells, so we won't linger very long, but I'll put the link in a pinned comment for you if you want to read it at your own intellectual peril. Let us see some of the passages that clearly support pedophilia and rape of preteen girls. And then we have Numbers 31 referenced and the underlined portions in verse 18. Now, the context of the text that allegedly supports rape is where punishment is being dealt out for the shockingly obscene sins at Baal Peor. And in there we find the Midianites and the Moabites referenced. Now, the Midianites were sort of a confederation of tribes, of which the Moabites were one. But all of the young girls, referring to the Midianites and Moabites, who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. It is ironic that people see this verse condoning sexual immorality with the daughters of Moab, given that what started all of this was sexual immorality with the daughters of Moab. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. But let's ignore that blatantly contradictory misinterpretation of the passage and get to the heart of the issue. When female captives are taken in battle, there is a procedure in Deuteronomy 21 that governs marriage and sexual relations. I produced a video on that elsewhere on this channel, so we'll just comment briefly on that text.
I'll play the video now that Islam Critiqued was talking about for Deuteronomy 21 verses 10 to 14, so you don't have to click anywhere else to watch it. The video will explain how female captives are to be treated according to the Old Testament.
Deuteronomy 21:10 through 14 states, "When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wishes. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her." Rape of female captives was common on ancient battlefields, and of course the question is whether or not this is allowed under the Mosaic Law, particularly here in Deuteronomy. First, some background knowledge. With respect to captives from the enemies mentioned in verse 10, this is an exclusion to the marriage of Canaanite women, which is forbidden in Deuteronomy 7 due to the abhorrent practices of the Canaanites. I've elaborated on some of these in other videos in this series. It is possible that the law was understood as requiring the women to convert to Judaism for the marriage to actually occur. More on this later. If a man wants to take a wife for himself, he is required to provide for her from his own resources during the mourning period in verses 12 through 13. As a side note, some rabbis, like Rabbi Akiva, for instance, say that the full month in verse 13 actually refers to 3 months. 3 months would be more consistent with what we expect, given this was a more typical time frame to determine if a woman was pregnant or not in a pre-scientific age. In this case, we may be looking at a Hebrew idiom where a full month actually refers to 3. I won't argue for or against this since it's not particularly relevant to this video, but it's an interesting side note nonetheless. According to some commentators like Rabbi Rashi, the clothes which she was captured in verse 13, refer to the ancient custom of Gentile women in times of war dressing very attractively and provocatively to seduce enemy soldiers away from victory. In contrast to this seductive beauty, the woman was made to appear unattractive by putting on clothes of mourning consistent with Israelite customs. According to Talmudic exegetes, this could be for one of two reasons. Marrying a woman because of her beauty alone was highly discouraged. As such, she was made to appear unattractive. Or this may be symbolic of shedding her previous life among a pagan nation. In addition to these possibilities, the ultimate purpose of shedding the clothes of her captivity is to be in accordance with Israelite customs of mourning, as the text plainly states, which included a particular style of distressed adornment common in the ancient world. Also, with respect to verse 13, Tigay notes in his commentary on Deuteronomy on page 194, since verse 13 does not mention a husband, for whom a married captive would surely mourn, the law possibly has only unmarried women in mind. This is certainly a plausible inference, but as Deuteronomic law is not meant to be exhaustive, Tigay correctly does not state this definitively. If the man chooses to divorce the woman, he was not allowed to sell her as a slave, verse 14. This is significant because the man has nothing to gain monetarily by divorcing her. It's not a situation where the man has nothing to lose and everything to gain. With nothing to gain by divorce, this increases the level of responsibility required of the man in marrying the woman in the first place. Also, for verse 14 regarding the phrase, "if you no longer delight in her," some commentators interpret this phrase homiletically as a caution. Again, Tigay notes this in his commentary on this passage. The idea being that if a man sees a beautiful woman and because of that desires to marry her, he's doing it for the wrong reason, and the marriage will eventually fail. Regardless, this phrase shouldn't be taken trivially. Deuteronomy regards the sanctity of marriage very seriously in chapter 22, verses 13 through 21, for example, which restricts the husband's right to divorce a wife he doesn't like for superficial reasons. With respect to the passage as a whole, I'll quote from Christopher Wright in his commentary on Deuteronomy, page 234. He says, "There are 4 ways in which this law benefits the captured woman. A. She is not to be raped or to be enslaved as a concubine, but is to be accorded the full status of a wife," verses 11 and 13. The instruction in Hebrew is quite clear that only marriage is intended. B. She is to be given time to adjust to the traumatic new situation and to ritually mourn for the parents who are now dead as far as she is concerned. This is to take place within the security of her new home, not in some prisoner or refugee camp. C. The law compassionately restricts even the soldier's, quote, bridegroom rights by postponing any sexual intercourse with the woman until this month of mourning and adjustment is over. D. If the man finally changes his mind and will not undertake marital responsibility towards her, she is to leave as a free woman. He can take no further advantage over her by selling her as a slave. Thus, the physical and emotional needs of the woman in her utter vulnerability are given moral and legal priority over the desires and claims of the man in his victorious strength. Admittedly, Wright has a rather glowing review of this passage, which at first appears incredibly harsh to our ears. I want to pose a few questions of the text as well as some plausible answers to see if the positive opinion of this passage we just heard is warranted. Number 1, does the text allow rape on the battlefield as was typical for the time? No, this is prohibited by verse 13, which says after the things in the previous verse have taken place, only then can the marriage legally occur. Battlefield rape is obviously prohibited. The next couple of questions I will pose have to do with arguments frequently expressed by critics as well. Does desiring her in verse 11 refer to rape? This argument comes to us from an Islamic source via the website answering-christianity.com in an article entitled Biblical Law Permits Rape of Female Captives, written by Kevin Abdullah Karim, and cites Young's literal translation, which is a 19th century work from a self-taught linguist. Young's translation says, "For verse 11, hast delighted in her." Karim then, without any textual evidence, says that this is an idiom for rape. Quote, "The expression, and hast delighted in her, is a reference to sexual intercourse by force." To substantiate this astonishing claim, which apparently for him has materialized out of thin air, he cites Matthew Poole, who says in a source not cited in the article, "Hast taken delight in her," which may be a modest expression for lying with her. So Karim first states out of nowhere that delighted necessarily means intercourse by force, and then he quotes a 17th century commentary which does not even reinforce his claim. Additionally, Karim fails to address the entire text. As I indicated in my answer to one above, there is a sequence of events which must take place prior to sexual intercourse. Further, the attitude in Deuteronomy toward rape is that it is a crime worthy of death. More on this later. Finally, the text itself defines what desiring her means, to quote Deuteronomy 21:11, "And you desire her, and would take her to wife." So the desire is unto marriage. Much to his discredit, Karim decided to reach back in time to a 17th century commentary, which, by the way, he misconstrues, instead of simply allowing the rest of the verse itself to guide his exegesis. Question number 3. Does the Hebrew word for humiliated, defiled, or alternatively made low in verse 14, depending on the translation, necessarily imply rape? This argument refers to the Hebrew root for the word translated humiliated or defiled in verse 14, and says that this meaning implies that the defiling refers to a prior rape, which then would be implicitly authorized by the passage. However, this is not at all true. Professor Ellen Van Wold, for example, published a profound article examining this word entitled, "Does Inah Denote Rape? A Semantic Analysis of a Controversial Word." This article is available online from academic resources. I was able to easily obtain a copy for free, and I encourage others who are further interested to do the same. In this article, she states, the previous series of actions, her being taken captive, her transfer into an Israelite household, the sexual intercourse, all these actions are resumed here with the verb inah. It does not reflect illegal or illicit sex because the previous verse showed that this intercourse was acceptable. This evaluation with the term inah is presented in combination with the spatial preposition tahat, under, she whom you bowed down, and it is said the moment she is in danger of being discarded, sold as a slave. However low her social status may be, she is not to be degraded. In sum, this text does not talk about rape, but about an accepted form of sexual intercourse in Israel between an Israelite man and a non-Israelite captive woman. Does verse 13 allow the man to have intercourse with a woman even if she resists after the mourning rites are completed? Having demonstrated that the text itself, lexically and philologically, does not refer to the woman being raped, I want to further reinforce the answer to this question, which is in the negative, by examining a passage that gives us a very good indication of the attitude Deuteronomic law takes on the protection of women. There is much going on in the verses surrounding the passage I'll be citing, and I won't be addressing these issues since it's beyond the scope of this video. But for now, I do want to stress that while critics of Deuteronomy often issue scathing rebukes of the law, in doing so they only demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the text as well as no knowledge of the context of the ancient world. Again, I won't be addressing these misunderstandings where they occur elsewhere in the surrounding text, but as we proceed through the passage I'm about to comment on, a new understanding will emerge for those who previously lacked sufficient background knowledge, which will demonstrate how easily Deuteronomic law can be misunderstood by the modern English reader, and how a more thoughtful and informed approach is required. Deuteronomy 22:25 through 27 states, "But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense, punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her." This passage is in contrast spatially to the one which precedes it. Deuteronomy 22:24 refers to not crying out for help, though she was in the city. Now, there were obviously other people present in these very close communities within walled cities in the ancient world, and the text, which is only meant to establish the general structure of the law, simply assumes people are within shouting range, and the woman did not cry out for help because if she would have, it would have been heard. So the text is a contrast of two, what today we might call basic or even simplistic scenarios. These scenarios are contrasted in two cases. Number one, illicit, consensual, sexual intercourse. How do we know? Again, the reason seems simplistic to our ears, but it was because the woman had the chance to call for help within the walls of the city, and she did not. Since she offered no protest, she is not allowed to claim to the court, after the fact, that she was raped. The intercourse is judged to be consensual. So, whereas this prevents the woman from avoiding the legal penalty for illicit, though consensual intercourse, by claiming falsely that she was raped, the next case addresses a scenario where a woman is unable to substantiate her claim. It is in the open country where there is no one to rescue her. Now, there is a very obvious but frequently overlooked provision made in this law. In the open country, if a woman is raped, she can produce no witnesses. As the text assumes, there is no one to rescue her. However, significantly, the text clearly states that the man can be put to death. This is why Muslim critics are extremely misguided in pointing this verse out as a criticism of Deuteronomic law, implying that through this verse, at least in part, somehow rape is not condemned under the Mosaic law. They fail to think this through. In the ancient world, witnesses in court were extremely important, much more than they are today. Take rape, for example. We can easily convict a rapist, even a very clever rapist, who has managed to construct a very plausible alibi, if the DNA evidence supports it. We would think nothing of a newspaper headline that states, "Rapist pronounced guilty with no witnesses to the crime," if the DNA evidence was substantial. Not so in the pre-scientific ancient world. Witnesses were crucial in criminal proceedings. Consider this law from the Middle Assyrian Code, Tablet A. If a married woman was walking on the street and a man has grabbed her and said to her, "Let me have sex with you," and if she was not willing and defended herself, but he has taken her by force and raped her, whether they catch him on the wife or they have testimony that he forced her, the elders are to have him executed. The woman is not to be held responsible. Now, as with the Torah or any other legal code, it should be noted that these are far removed from our cultural context, and it is improper for us to read into the text more than we should. For example, the law specifies married women. May we infer a priori from this that there was a sort of free-for-all on unmarried women? I think not. Likewise, the law implies very strongly that, to be prosecuted, the man has to be caught in the act on top of the woman, or as a lesser, more indirect means of proof, that on the basis of witnesses, the woman's lack of consent prior to the act could be established, thereby condemning the man to death. Notice that I'm not saying that in the absence of the minimum required number of witnesses, that the judges would reject this case, but it does appear, from a face value reading of the text, that it was only by proof ascertained by one of these two methods that the man's guilt was sufficiently confirmed, and he was to be sentenced to death. And though we want to be very sympathetic to the claims of a woman who says she was raped, the fact remains that the penalty is final capital punishment. And given the nature of the penalty in the context of a pre-scientific world where evidence consisted of eyewitness testimony, we must also be sympathetic to the fact that the law is concerned, as it clearly states, with establishing proper proof, in that, as a general rule at least, the code requires witnesses to attest to the crime before the man can be put to death. This emphasis on witnesses is clearly present in the Deuteronomic text as well. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime, or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses, or of 3 witnesses, shall a charge be established. However, it will be apparent by now to the careful reader that in the open country, cited in Deuteronomy 22:25-27, the text clearly is conveying a situation where no other people, and therefore no witnesses, are present. However, the law prescribes the death penalty to the man. Therefore, this penalty would be handed down on the basis of the woman's testimony alone. This is possibly an exception to the Middle Assyrian law cited above, and certainly an exception to the general rule for 2 to 3 witnesses minimum prescribed in Deuteronomy 19. The text condemns rape in yet another way. Aside from prescribing capital punishment, it compares ambushing a woman and raping her to murder. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor. Not only does it condemn rape via capital punishment, and by comparing it to murder, it goes beyond other provisions of the law and allows the man to be prosecuted according to the investigation and evaluation of the judges adjudicating the case. The judges are not allowed to reject the woman's claim even though no witnesses other than the woman's can be produced, and this is why Muslims should stop using any arguments related to this text. This is in contrast to Islamic law, where a woman's testimony is held in very low regard, worth half that of a man's, if it is accepted at all, apparently because she is intellectually deficient. Not only does Deuteronomy 22 controvert the claims of Muslim polemicists that Deuteronomy does not prohibit rape, it further backfires because it regards the testimony of a woman far superior to Islamic law. Finally, notice very importantly for those who want to limit this law to events that occur in the open country, that when this text compares rape to murder, it brings the context back from the open country into the city. It compares the case to that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor. In the end, the law eliminates any such notion of spatial distinction. The text makes clear this is a concern inside the city as well. For an Israelite man who rapes a woman in isolation affects his fellow men and women in the same way as a man who murders his neighbor. For those who want to claim this law is only applicable to special geographical circumstances and does not apply to day-to-day life in ancient Israel, they would have to contend with the fact that the law brings the crime back home, so to speak, back inside the city walls of the community it affects. Thus, the position Deuteronomic law takes on a man raping a woman is one which compares it to murder, requires capital punishment, and even expands protection for women by portraying all of this in a worst-case scenario in which the death penalty is prescribed even with otherwise insufficient witnesses. It further speaks to the trauma of rape, not only for the woman but for society, stating the rape of a woman in isolation is as reprehensible as a man killing his neighbor in the immediate community. At this point, I have demonstrated from Deuteronomy 21:10-14 that the text does not, in fact, imply rape. Further, I have demonstrated that Deuteronomy 22:25-27 has much more depth than one might initially think. This seemingly shallow text, which apparently condemns rape only in certain arbitrary circumstances, in reality condemns very strongly rape in any context. But in the scenario in which the law is presented, several important additional principles are able to be succinctly communicated, not the least of which includes an additional provision for women who cannot produce witnesses, and the relation of a crime of raping a woman in a remote area to the murder that occurs within the city, which speaks of the high regard the law maintains for women. I will add one final note about why the text specifies a betrothed woman. This is frequently misunderstood, and all sorts of erroneous conclusions are drawn from it. However, the specific requirement of betrothed women in this verse is not some sort of open season on women who aren't betrothed, as some crassly suggest. Rather, ancient Near Eastern legal codes frequently refer to rape in cases of unmarried or betrothed women, as Dr. TK notes in the JPS commentary on this passage. This is most probably due to experience at the time, having to do with how and when marriages were arranged in their culture. Their legal codes were written to address their issues at their time. Having firmly removed rape from the possibilities in Deuteronomy 21:10-14, both textually and from other legal codes in Deuteronomy, other questions remain, assuming, for the sake of argument, that the woman could be forced to marry against her will, as opposed to intercourse against her will, which we previously discussed. How are we to understand the practical application of this law? Would she despise her potential husband, or would she see this as an opportunity to increase her social status, from a captive of war to a wife? What if the woman, in addition to resisting intercourse, resisted the mourning rites or the marriage? Would the marriage still be permitted if the woman refused to convert to Judaism? Is Deuteronomy 7, which seems only to be prohibiting intermarriage with Canaanites, to be extended to other nations as well, as could be argued from the geographical context in which the law was issued? Indications of this occur in the prophets and very clearly in rabbinic thought. These are all valid questions, but I choose not to speculate about how a woman would react in such a case. The culture and practices are far too removed from anything we're familiar with today.
Now that we understand how female captives were to be treated according to the Old Testament, we will now go back to Islam Critique's original video on Numbers 31 verses 17 to 18.
I produced a video on that elsewhere on this channel, so we'll just comment briefly on that text. TK says, this law requires a soldier who wishes to marry a captive woman to show consideration for her feelings. He must allow her to adjust to all that has happened by bringing her back to his home and waiting a month before marrying her. In case he later becomes dissatisfied with her, he may not reduce her to slavery. A significant aspect of this law is its respect for the personhood of the captive woman and the moral obligations created by initiating a sexual relationship with her. When referring to the rituals that are required of the woman for this procedure, Merrill states that the process presupposes a degree of willingness on the part of the maiden to forsake the past and to embrace a new and different way of life. For one can hardly conceive of all this taking place coercively. It seems the law here wants to discourage such a marriage, because having the woman trim her nails and cut her hair and stay in a state of mourning for a month would reduce her physical attractiveness, which no doubt is what drew the man to her in the first place. Also, the man would have to provide for her as she sat untouched in a state of mourning for a full month. This means something in an ancient Near Eastern culture, which is largely subsistence-based living. Also, the law seems to indicate that a marriage on these sorts of grounds, in these sorts of circumstances, is anticipated to fail. Deuteronomy 21:14 closely follows, but if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. You shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. Notice the text says you have humiliated her. It doesn't speak highly of this process, to say the least. This passage, like many in the Torah, seems to acknowledge the stubbornness of people and puts in place guidelines because of it. In this case, guidelines to safeguard the personhood of the captive woman. Laws given in this context are reminiscent of what Jesus talked about in Mark chapter 10. I'll let you review that text if you need to. So critics of the Old Testament typically talk about genocide, but the girls are saved from destruction. And they talk about slavery in the Old Testament. But captive women shall not be sold for money, nor shall they be treated like a slave. Neither of those two criticisms are an option, so the critics move to the third option, that is rape. But where is that in the text of Numbers 31? Well, it's right there. You just have to look really closely. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves, so that you may rape them, treating them as sex slaves. Now you may say, that last part isn't in the text, and I agree, it's not in the text. So where is it? Well, it's in the imaginations of the critics. Now, I don't normally watch debates, but I came across one recently, and it's perfect for this video, so I thought I would play a couple of clips from it. It illustrates perfectly something that I call interpretation via imagination. you'll notice very quickly that this individual's assumption evolves into an interpretation. Watch closely. Here's the assumption.
I'm not entirely sure what a bunch of aggressive males could want with a bunch of virgin girls. I'll leave that up to the imagination of the audience.
And just a couple of minutes later, it's the interpretation.
Maybe we could just put it up to a divine mystery why the moral creator of the universe would allow people to take sex slaves.
So we have assumption.
I'll leave that up to the imagination of the audience.
Interpretation.
Put it up to a divine mystery why the moral creator of the universe would allow people to take sex slaves.
Assumption.
I'm not entirely sure. I'll leave that up to the imagination of the audience.
Interpretation.
Maybe the author of morality can permit sexual slavery.
Do you see how easy it is for a critic's imagination to become his authoritative interpretation? It doesn't take very long either. Now, this person calls himself the cosmic skeptic. One would think that the cosmic skeptic would be consistent enough to be skeptical of his own assumptions he's making about a text that he himself admits he's not qualified to interpret.
Moving on, now let's take a look at the objection of how did they know who was and who wasn't a virgin. For this objection, I'll let a YouTuber called In Thy Word explain it. A link to his channel will be left below so you can check it out if you want.
How do we know who are the virgins? And that's when you hear stories like the men would have to rape them or the men would penetrate them to determine who was a virgin or not. Logically, that really doesn't make much sense anyway, because if you're now going to penetrate a woman to determine if they're a virgin, then what aren't they anymore? A virgin, right? So it would literally make no sense. We're going to unpack that even more in the future. But before we get there, there's 3 things I want to highlight from the Bible that can give you even more context in regards to determining a virgin. Okay, so the first thing isn't just subject to the Bible, but I'm going to highlight common sense. What do I mean by that? Well, just even in the day and age we live in, we can say, okay, cool. Common sense will tell us that a young female baby is clearly not an active child, okay, by any stretch of the imagination. They would not be complicit in any sort of sexual activity, okay? And we can ascertain that up until a certain level of age just through common sense, that logically this person is not intending to have any sort of sexual relationships. So the second thing is something from the Bible, which we see in the book of 2 Samuel. Get this example from a woman in the Bible who was actually raped. And after she was raped, it talks about how the king's daughters generally wore these special robes to classify them as virgins. And basically she couldn't wear the robe anymore because she wasn't technically a virgin anymore. Now again, this isn't a clear-cut thing because yes, women can lie, but it also adds addition to the whole common sense approach that I just gave you. So this is a custom that the Israelites had. But even additionally to that, which gives us more context, is the tokens that we read about in the book of Deuteronomy. We read about this where it was basically the father and the mother of a damsel would have to collect these tokens as a sign of a woman being a virgin on her wedding day. The blood from that event would be tokens, as the scripture calls it. That was the job of the parents to basically hold that in reserve, just in case at any point in time the husband would try and come and say, oh, this woman was not pure, etc. So I've highlighted to you pretty much 3 different ways, 2 ways we specifically see in the Bible which highlight how women who were virgins were actively sort of tracked. And this gives us insights into what the Israelites were doing, but also can lend us some insights into maybe some of the practices and customs that the people around that time were actually doing to determine who was a virgin and who wasn't. So those are 3 logical ways and societal ways that we see from the scriptures that can ascertain much more logically than actually forcing a woman or penetrating a woman to determine if they were actually a virgin or not. And I'm sure you would agree, right?
Well, that's it for today, guys. You can feel free to download this video, upload it to your monetized channels, and use it however you want. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.